This podcast will look at how to answer the question 4 from 2012. This is June 2012. And the question is, in what ways did the Nazi government use education to spread their ideas about race and minority groups? As you can see, it's worth 12 marks, which would be about 18 minutes, 1.5 minutes per mark, to answer that question in the exam. So clearly it needs to be thought through and it needs to be paragraphed if you're going to write for that long. Probably in 18 minutes you should probably be aiming to write 1.5 to 2 sides in answer to this question. Now, as always, what they do here is they give you some prompts. These are very much directed at the weaker candidates to give you some material to work with, but there's that huge word of caution. You're given some ideas of what you could include. So, for example, you're told most teachers in Nazi Germany were members of the Nazi Teachers Association, school textbooks were rewritten, race studies was introduced. The weaker candidates will just latch onto those 3 points and just talk round and round those 3 points, and will include very little extra information. So there's a huge word of caution. They're given to help you to get you started, but you've got to add much more to your answer than just the 3 points that you've been given there. So be very careful in using what we call the prompts. Now, before we look at my model plan and how I would approach it, this is the mark scheme. The mark scheme is always useful. It gives you some examples of content. So for the first level, a simple statement which would be worth 1 to 4 marks out of the 12. It tells you Jews were made fun of, they were written about in school textbooks. Getting slightly better, again it gives some example of content, e.g. the candidate talks about the lessons that were taught and the contents of the textbook. And level 3, another example of content, e.g. the candidate shows how the curriculum was used to spread the Nazi ideas. So looking at the mark schemes in your revision gives you some sort of idea of the type of content that you could include. So you've got 3 bits of content there, just to give you a sort of start on the type of information to include in your answer. Much more useful, however, is this. Now, this is the Chief Examiner report for June 2012. Looking at level 3, which is the better answers, it clearly highlights detailed explanation about how the Nazi government used education to spread their ideas about race and minority groups. Come back to that in a second. If you go down to level 2, it points out that many candidates scored low because they failed to recognise the thrust of the question, and all they did was talk about education for boys and girls and how they were prepared for different roles. So this is an example of how candidates can lose marks. They didn't look at the question properly. All they saw was the word education, and they thought, right, I'll just talk about everything I know about schools. And they'd failed to recognise that the question said about how the question is about how education used race ideas, how education developed ideas about race and minority groups. So they didn't really look at the question carefully enough. Now, if you go to level 3, it clearly emphasises this, that the best answers, level 3, students explained how Nazi beliefs about Aryan supremacy and anti-Semitism were spread in textbooks through the school curriculum and by control of teachers. And again, the Chief Examiner's report gives examples, eugenics, social Darwinism, Lebensraum. Social Darwinism is the survival of the fittest, the Nazi belief in survival of the fittest, the law of the jungle, the law of nature. And another useful point, it says the question is about the treatment of minority groups, which would include gypsies and disabled people, not just Jews. And it says it's surprising how few candidates failed to talk about other minority groups. That most candidates just talked about policies against the Jews. So lots of information in the Chief Examiner's report to help you score a good mark if you get a similar question this year. Now let's take a look at the answer that I have written for you. Okay, so with this one, again, we'll just analyse the question first. So there's really two parts to the question. It's about how education was used, but it's also about how it was used to spread ideas about race and other minority groups. Okay, so there's a focus on the racial aspect and there's a focus on education. So the way I would have approached it, because it's two elements to the question, is in a sense my first two paragraphs would have unpicked those two elements. So it's almost like a two-part introduction. So my first paragraph would have been focusing very much in on Nazi racial ideas, Nazi ideas about race and minority groups, to show that you understand that. So again, a bold first sentence, so it's clear what the paragraph is about. It's very clear that you're going to talk about two groups. So on the one hand, again, the use of language, it suggests that further down in the answer you're going to move into on the other hand. Okay, so on the one hand, there were the master race. Use the German word if you can, the Herrenfolk, they were the Aryans. On the other hand, there were the Untermenschen or subhumans, which included Jews, but there were other minority groups, Slavs, mentally ill, vagrants, black gypsies, so black people and gypsies. And then develop the point about what the Nazi ideas were, that the Nazis did not want pure Aryan blood to be mixed with the blood from minority groups, including Jews, that they believed that mixing of blood diluted future greatness, basically. So that's your first paragraph. Now then your second paragraph develops that by saying, right, education was crucial to achieve these racial aims. Again, a strong topic sentence, so you're linking the topic of education to the idea of race. So you need, therefore, to clearly say children were Germany's future. They needed to be indoctrinated in racial ideas so that when they grew up they would select racially pure marriage partners, so that as parents they would breed lots of racially pure Aryans. So you're clearly linking education to the issue of race. Remember, the Chief Examiner's report said that many candidates didn't really hardly refer to race. All they did was write an answer about schools with maybe just an occasional reference touched upon race, almost incidentally. Whereas what you're doing here with this answer is you're clearly showing you understand what the question is about. Then, in the next few paragraphs, you really get into talking about how education was organised. So this paragraph, paragraph 3, is about the organisation of education. It focuses very much on teachers. Okay, so Hitler brought teachers under control, so it talks about the teachers. Now that was one of the prompts in the question. So you were given the information about the Nazi Teachers Association. Schools were inspected, Nazi inspectors and children were encouraged to report teachers to their Hitler youth leaders. So here you're developing the prompt, you're not just repeating what the prompt in the question had said for you. Teachers therefore were brought into line and teachers taught Nazi racial ideas, even though they might not actually be members of the Nazi party. You then move into the next paragraph, which talks, let's move that down a bit, which talks about the reorganisation of the German education system. So the sort of changes to the structure of education. So, for example, Jewish children were not allowed to attend German schools, had to have their own separate Jewish schools. and also the fact that the Nazis created special schools for future German leaders, and therefore the sort of very elite, the top level of German children, the most racially pure German children, all boys, girls weren't included, went to the Adolf Hitler schools, the Nappelers and the Order Castles. And remember, the Adolf Hitler schools for party leaders, the Nappelers were for army leaders, and the Order Castles were for future SS soldiers. We then move into the next paragraph, which is the paragraph that most of the weaker candidates would just get straight into at the beginning of their answer. So you wouldn't do that, you'd have developed those earlier points. And this is where you talk about all the things about how education was taught, okay, or about what actually happened in schools. So education to spread the racial ideas through changing the curriculum. So again, notice big emphasis on racial ideas. Don't just talk about education. Talk about how the lessons were organised to spread race, to talk about race. So how were Jews portrayed? They were portrayed as vermin, paedophiles, seducers of innocent children. An example of a famous children's storybook, The Poisonous Mushroom. New subjects. There's the subject eugenics, sometimes called race studies, which all children had to study. Pupils were taught in these lessons not to marry inferior racial types such as Jews. Nazi ideas of race and the inferiority of subhumans. They measured skulls, they measured the sizes of noses, for example, to classify racial types. History lessons, they were taught that the Jews were behind the stab in the back. In PE lessons, they would work in teams so that it would promote healthy and racially reliable Germans, and so on and so forth. Notice how all the way through that you're constantly referring to race. Is the sort of the sort of central word all the way through the answer. Okay, the issue of race, and that's where many candidates lost marks, because they would simply describe what education was like rather than linking it to the question. And then a conclusion, which pulls it all together. I mean, pretty much read as it is. Education was the key for the Nazis to promote their dangerous racist ideas and to ensure the growth of a master race. Children were the future. If they could be indoctrinated, there's a key word, indoctrination, in racial ideas. This would ensure the long-term expansion of a strong Germany. Again, good historical words like long-term are important, in which Germans were racially pure. Keywords, Herrenfolk, Untermenschen, and minority groups would be excluded. So the Nazi policy was to take control of education, design a new curriculum, rewrite textbooks and create special schools, so it pulls it together nicely. Okay, all of that in 18 minutes. Best advice, have a go at writing that answer yourself now.